The World Economic Forum and the New World Order, they've gotten to the point where they own all the big institutions, and they've decided that 1% of the world is going to rule the other 99% going forward by creating an entire generation of docile debt slaves. They're increasingly owning all the food. They're increasingly owning all the houses. Now they're going to own all the money. Even what is in your bank account is going to be owned by the government. They're going to see everything you do. They're going to know how much money you have in your account. They're going to know how you spend it. So we're in grave danger.
There are two potentially grim scenarios for the U.S. housing market, both involving geopolitical issues that some may say have been planned for more than 50 years. Powerful organizations such as the World Economic Forum seem to be spearheading a new world order, and the WEF's founder and now executive chairman Klaus Schwab has indicated that they're in the process of mastering the fourth industrial revolution. Now here's where things come completely off the rails, as their plans seem to involve control, more globalization, and globalized digital currency. In a futuristic world where you'll own nothing and be happy, this includes housing. To get more of a perspective on how things may be unraveling, I turn to those who made a living on Wall Street, serving some of the most powerful companies in the world. John Rubino, thanks so much for coming back to the show.
Todd, it's great to talk to you again.
John, for those who don't know you, tell us about your Wall Street days.
Okay. The broad part of my story is that I've been involved in financial bubbles one way or another, basically forever. In the 1970s, when I was in college, I got interested in gold and silver and stuff like that, just in time for gold and silver to turn into a bubble towards the end of that decade. Then I went out, got an MBA, ended up on Wall Street, just in time for the junk bond bubble to expand and burst. I was a junk bond analyst for a while. Then I was a writer for an online magazine called TheStreet.com. I was a tech stock columnist for them, just as the tech stock bubble expanded and burst. Then I wrote a book about the real estate bubble in the early 2000s, not too long before that bubble burst. So it's not on purpose or anything. It's just kind of inadvertently I've been involved in financial bubbles forever. And now, we all get to experience the everything bubble blowing up and then bursting. So that kind of bookends my adult life, right? And probably there will be a gold and silver bull market at the end of this thing. So I started with that and I'll end with that, it looks like.
Yeah, well, you've authored and co-authored many books, and like you said, talking about the housing market and including geopolitical issues and how the world's reserve currency, the U.S. dollar, will eventually collapse. I mean, you've written books, and you used to write, you had the dollarcollapse.com. But let's start off telling everyone why you've kind of made it your life's mission to warn Americans about things you believe will happen in our lifetime.
Well, at almost any time in my adult life, as I said, there have been big financial bubbles going on. That seemed to me to be the most interesting story that's around. These incredible financial booms and busts that we keep having, and then the problems that underlie those booms and busts. And I think that's the big story of our time. If we avoid a nuclear war, give us a nuclear war and all of this financial stuff becomes very, very secondary. But avoid Armageddon and the fiat currency experiment that began in 1971 and has led to the world being wildly over-indebted and is going to lead to some kind of a gigantic crisis. That's been the best story to tell. To me, there was nothing going on in the world that was more interesting than that. So I didn't set out intending to tell that story for 30 years, but that's kind of how it worked out, because it's taking a lot longer for the fiat currency experiment to fail than I expected. But, fail it is in the not too distant future, probably. But yeah, it's been an interesting story. It's been a fun ride. And, I can picture a lot of different lives that I could have led. But this one was a very interesting one because this is just such a big deal. Humanity has never tried this kind of an experiment before. And it's so manifestly a failure that the failure is going to be the biggest part of the story. And so I'm happy to be here at the end chronicling it.
Well, John, today I want to discuss your opinions on the housing market. We wrote about it before, and your your prophecy came true. I want to talk about a digital currency, a global digital currency, and how the BRIC nations desire to end their dependency on the dollar, along the same narrative as you were just talking about, the potential dollar collapse, and then also the expiration of the agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States, potentially ending the petrodollar, and really get your thoughts on whether you believe Russia was posturing recently against the United States when they were, for 5 days, they had their military presence with their Russian warships and a nuclear-powered submarine anchored at Havana Bay, some 90 miles from Florida. So does that sound good? Sound like some good topics to talk about today?
Yeah, that sounds like some fairly important things we can talk about. Yeah, so let's start with the BRICS thing,
Okay.
the Saudi story, because that was kind of a bit of misdirection. Basically, what happened was Saudi Arabia let a 50-year-old cooperation pact with the U.S. lapse. And then a lot of people saw that as the end of the petrodollar. In other words, Saudi Arabia has done away with the petrodollar by letting this thing lapse. And that wasn't quite the case. But a lot of places ran with the story, including me. What happened was, in reality, is that the U.S. and the Saudis are negotiating a new cooperation pact that to replace the one that the Saudis let lapse. And they just let it lapse because they're working on a new one. So it was not the Saudis killing the petrodollar. But having said that, there's a lot of things going on, especially with the BRICS countries, that are pointing in that direction. It's just happening more slowly than one stroke of a pen that ends that relationship. Basically, the BRICS countries, and that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with a lot of other countries, including Saudi Arabia, that are now part of that group, are to various extents sick of the U.S. having the world's reserve currency and using it as a weapon. In other words, if somebody crosses the U.S. empire, we kick their banks out of the SWIFT international bank settlement system, or we slap sanctions on their exports, or we steal their assets that are in London banks or New York banks or whatever. And that's understandably very frustrating for China and Russia and India and other countries that have aspirations to be at least powers within their neighborhood. So they're looking for ways to get around having to use the dollar for everything, and they're buying lots of gold and or repatriating gold. India, for instance, just repatriated 100 tons of gold from London banks to Indian banks, and central banks in the BRICS coalition and also in other groups are buying gold at an accelerating rate. So they're in effect switching from dollar-denominated assets like treasury bonds to gold as their reserve assets, which are in the sense that gold is neutral. If you own gold, you're not picking a side, and you're not helping the U.S. dominate the world. So a lot of central banks, especially the Chinese, but many others, are buying a lot of gold. And the thought is that at some point, the BRICS countries will be able to create a trading currency that they'll back with gold, and it won't replace their national currencies, but they'll be able to use it when trading with each other. And that will replace a lot of the dollars that they have to use now. So the trend away from US dollars as the world's only reserve asset and only major trading currency is pretty much underway. And the BRICS countries are big enough, they own enough resources, they have enough people, they cover enough land to give them a legitimate claim to be able to create a currency that is at least a competitor with the dollar, though it definitely won't be a replacement anytime soon, but it could be something they can use. And so then it gets interesting, because if if countries start trading with other currencies or using gold and other currencies as their reserve assets, that means that the tens of trillions of dollars that are sloshing around in the world right now are not as necessary. And then the people who have those dollars or those treasury bonds or whatever need to do something with those things. So they're either buying gold or they're shipping those dollars back to the US to buy US assets. And that's potentially really inflationary because let's say $10 trillion comes home and starts buying up Seattle real estate and condos in Miami and U.S. factories and U.S. houses. That pushes the prices of those things up, which is the same thing as saying that it pushes the price of the dollar down. So it could be very inflationary as this goes on. So, we didn't really dodge a bullet with this Saudi thing not turning out to be that big of a deal. We just put ourselves back in the long, slow slog that we're seeing in which other countries figure out ways around the dollar, and the dollar becomes less and less necessary in the world. In other words, this will be a big ongoing story for years to come with a potential pretty chaotic ending. And in that sense, we want to watch it and we want to see what the investment implications are and be ready to pounce when some really obvious investment thesis flows from it.
That's interesting. I've never heard anyone lay it out like you just did. So essentially, and this makes complete sense, and I want to kind of break it down because the petrodollar, as I understand it, was this 50-year-old agreement where, and correct me if I'm wrong, where I believe that the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia saying, look, we will invest in your oil exploration and development, the refining, and then you, in exchange for our investment, will require global trade of your oil to be in dollars, and then some of the profits from those will be then converted into U.S. treasuries, which we in turn have an influx of their money, for economic growth. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, with a couple extra pieces. One of the things we promised was to protect Saudi Arabia militarily because they were worried about losing a war to Iran, which could easily happen if those two got into it, because Iran is like 8 times as big as Saudi Arabia in population. And we promised to keep that from happening. And so that allowed the kind of bifurcated Saudi government, which is kind of a theocracy with some technocrats. You've got the House of Saud, which is the religious order that runs a big part of the country, partnered with the guys in the government, and the U.S. made that possible. And Saudi Arabia, by investing their excess dollars in U.S. treasuries, that allowed us to run massive deficits going forward without it really affecting our inflation rate or the exchange rate of the dollar. It stabilized everything for us. So it was a sweet deal for both parties. And it's not completely going away. We're still allied with Saudi Arabia. We would still protect them in a war. And we're now negotiating new cooperation deals. It's just that going forward, Saudi Arabia is no longer obligated to take only dollars for oil.
But John, a lot has changed because from my understanding, since, within the last 50 years, we took Saddam Hussein out of Iraq. So now Iran pretty much dominates Iraq, right? So now they have a lot more oil. And of course, it makes sense that the Saudis will need to have another agreement with us or continue that agreement. However, when you described about with our debt crisis and how a lot of people believe that we've weaponized the dollar, a lot of countries like the BRICS want to be less dependent on the dollar. So what you're saying is instead of investing in U.S. treasuries, these central bankers are now buying gold in preparation. So that's money that we're not getting. That's money that's not being reinvested into the U.S., into our treasuries. And so when we're talking about the BRICS nations, I mean, so you think this is a lot bigger deal than what many believe?
Oh, yeah. The BRICS thing is potentially a big deal. It's just not a next week kind of big deal. But the countries in the BRICS coalition, and it's growing, by the way. Lots of new countries want to join the BRICS. I mean, that Saudi Arabia joined was really astounding when it happened. It's a very powerful coalition, assuming they can work together. Now, the fact that a lot of them are buying gold and that there's a lot of speculation about this trading currency there, and that they're also working on central bank digital currencies. So in the not too distant future, they're going to have electronic central bank currencies that in some way, in some fashion, can be related to a trading currency that's backed by gold. That's not a simple proposition, but it's one that is really consequential if it can be made to work. And we'll have to see how it all goes. First of all, a lot of these guys are dictatorships. So cooperating in a financial sense like this requires a level of trust that most of them are not used to and not comfortable with. But it's a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, the U.S. is so much more dangerous in the eyes of a lot of these guys that I think that gives them an incentive to cooperate. And if they do choose to cooperate, they've got a lot of gold, with more gold coming in. They've got tons of natural resources, including oil. They have a massive manufacturing base in China and potentially India. So, it's if we divide the world into those two groups, the U.S. and Europe, plus a couple of other countries like Japan, and then the BRICS countries, it's not clear who you would favor 10 years hence in a financial war. So we'll see. But that's the kind of thing that is definitely coming. And it's going to come combined with a gigantic financial crisis when all the big fiat currencies start to fail, which is what's happening now, where government debt levels and the related interest costs for a lot of Western countries have just gone parabolic. They're going straight up. And you cannot sustain debt that is going straight up while you have interest rates that are normalizing, which means the interest cost on the debt goes through the roof. So we're in that kind of a box right now, which I think is actually more important than the BRICS story, because even if you totally took the BRICS out of the picture, the US, Europe, and Japan would be heading for this epic financial crisis because of all the debt that we've taken on, because we had fiat currencies, which allowed us to do it. So a lot of chickens are coming home to roost right now. And the way life works is, you don't normally just have one problem. You usually have several at the same time. And I think that's what the U.S. is facing, a financial crisis with a huge geopolitical thing going on, and then a demographic thing where the baby boomers are retiring and we need to be taken care of. We get all that Social Security and Medicare, and that just turbocharges the accretion of debt and interest expense for the U.S. So anyhow, lots of things happening, and chaos is probably the result of most of them.
Well, what do you think the U.S., what we're saying about Saudi joining the BRICS?
I can't believe we're happy about it.
I mean, if we're if we're saying that, we're working on this new agreement or what have you, and we're going to still protect them, but yet, they join the nations that wish to eliminate the world's reserve dependency or world's reserve currency, the dollar, eliminate dependency on it. I mean, that's kind of, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense geopolitically, because the Saudis, it seems like they have to choose a side, but right now they're not doing that. They're kind of smack dab in the middle. They're a part of the BRICS coalition, but they're negotiating cooperation agreements with the U.S. And geopolitically, in terms of the Middle East as well, where part of the deal that they're supposedly cutting with the U.S. will involve them recognizing Israel diplomatically, which can't make a lot of the rest of the Middle East happy either. So it's not clear how this plays out. And it's not clear that that the U.S. has its best people negotiating these deals now. So the way the timing of our elections work, it's completely possible that we get a little further into this this negotiation, and then Biden is out, Trump is in, and you've got a whole new set of negotiators with, in the case of Trump, probably the president sitting in a lot of the negotiations and wanting to get a hardball deal. So, it's a lot of these things are so amorphous right now that there's no way you can predict how it's going to turn out. because it has too many moving parts and too many interested parties who disagree with each other. So I don't have any idea how this plays out.
Well, back in March of 2022, and this is on whitehouse.gov, I can actually drop the link below in the show notes here, but there were remarks, this publication where it was remarks from the Business Roundtable office where Biden spoke before the Business Roundtable CEO quarterly meeting. And President Biden talked about his administration creating jobs and reducing unemployment, reducing the deficit. And he talked about needing to deal with global inflation. But he also said that sanctions on Russia caused real cost on the Russian economy and that Putin's back was against the wall. And we know that recently Russian warships and a nuclear-powered submarine were about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and they've since departed. And before President Biden ended his remarks, he said, and now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it, and we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it. I guess, with what you just spoke about, what do you think Biden was referring to? And when we talk about the BRICS and their annual conference being in Russia this year, and do you think Russia was posturing? Do you think Putin's back's against the wall? How do you think this is going to play out? China, one of the countries in the BRICS nation, we owe them a lot of money. They're holding a lot of our treasuries. What do you think is happening geopolitically with all this going on?
So you did a really good job of explaining how complex the world is right now with all these different moving parts. We owe China a lot of money. Russia's got nuclear submarines in Cuba. Let me take them bite-sized piece at a time. Russia sending its naval assets to Cuba is probably them trying to remind us of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that I think it was 1962. It was a time when the Soviet Union tried to put missiles in Cuba. And we said, no, there can't be a hostile military alliance right off our coast. We will fight World War III over this. And so they postured a little bit, and then everybody backed down. We took missiles out of Turkey. They took their missiles out of Cuba. And then we went back to the status quo. Well, today with Ukraine, we've got the same thing going in reverse. We're trying to put a hostile military alliance right on Russia's border. And Russia is saying what Kennedy said back in 1962. He's saying it's not acceptable to have NATO right on our borders because NATO is an anti-Russia military coalition. So Russia is willing to fight World War III in order to keep Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO. And I think, putting some assets in Cuba is his way of saying, people, it's the same thing, only reversed. So let's work it out the way we worked it out back then. Russia is offering peace deals here, and they have been. They've been willing to sign several so far, and the U.S. is always stepping in and saying no. Now, the reason for that moves over to the thing you said about the New World Order from Biden. The guys in charge of the U.S. government right now are what's called neoconservatives or neocons. And they believe that the next 100 years should be another American century in which the U.S., with 5% of the world's population, rules the rest of the world. And they want to achieve that by breaking Russia and China, and if necessary, India, and making them basically vassal states where we get all the natural resources or the cheap labor or whatever it is we want, and they basically do what they're told. This seems crazy to me because we're talking about nuclear powers here, starting a shooting war with Russia, which has more ICBMs than we do, doesn't seem like a smart idea, and it doesn't seem like something that leads to a good place, or at least the worst case scenario in a situation like that leads to the end of the human race and the poisoning of Earth for life for 1,000 years, and that we're doing that just scares the hell out of me, especially because I have two sons who could potentially be drafted. Oh, and you probably saw, Todd, that we're going back to draft registration now. We're getting ready for a Vietnam War era style selective service draft, where we just tell people, okay, you're 19 and healthy. Come on, you're a Marine now. We're going to start telling people stuff like that, and using them basically as cannon fodder. So, no matter how you look at this, it's just absolutely crazy. And the BRICS countries, frankly, seem to have a clearer view of what's going on in the world than the people who are speaking for the U.S. right now. So we need to fix this right now, one way or another. We need to cut some deals. We need to pull back our military forces. We need to cool things down, whether it's in Gaza or Ukraine or Taiwan or any of the, or Iran. We got a lot of places we've got to cool off right now, and that we're not doing it, that we're doing the opposite, just scares the hell out of me.
I hope you're enjoying the video with John so far. I just wanted to say that this podcast is brought to you by none other than SachsRealty.com. Here's where you can connect with me and our Sachs Realty agents if you're in Maryland. And if you're looking to buy, rent, or sell, we hope to hear from you. If you're anywhere other than Maryland, we have an amazing broker network. Simply visit SachsRealty.com, click on your state, and utilize the city drop-down to find an agent near you. Should there not be an agent in your city, feel free to send me an email directly, as our broker referral network is relatively new and we're adding great agents every day. Now back to the show.
We talk about a new world order. I think about United Nations. I think about the World Economic Forum. How does this all tie into that?
Well, this is a almost separate, but if anything, even crazier part of the process that we're looking at now. The World Economic Forum and the New World Order, and you own nothing and eat bugs and be happy, and that this whole thing is basically an aristocracy that fiat currencies have allowed to evolve. In other words, we made money so easy for the super rich that they got even richer, and they've gotten to the point where they own all the big institutions, and they've decided that 1% of the world is going to rule the other 99% going forward. And one way they're doing that is by creating an entire generation of debt slaves, using artificially low interest rates and globalization, which lowered wages in the developed world and forced people to borrow money in order to maintain middle-class lifestyles. They've created a group of people in the U.S., a really big group, who are more and more indebted all the time and less healthy. So you combine those two things, and the idea is that it makes us easy to control. Meanwhile, the necessities of life are being bought up by billionaires and corporations. You've got Bill Gates, for instance, just buying up crazy amounts of farmland. He's now the biggest private owner of farmland in the world. Why would he do that? Well, knowing Bill Gates, he's been a really aggressive competitor his entire life. If he's buying up farmland, it's not to protect it from environmental degradation. It's to corner the market in food, raise prices, and make that farmland worth even more. Meanwhile, the same thing is going on basically in the pharmaceutical industry, where they're making us sick with processed food and then treating the symptoms with pharmaceuticals. And let's see. Oh, and Wall Street is buying up houses at an accelerating rate. And so we've got hundreds of thousands or soon millions of houses in the hands of hedge funds, and they're converting them to rental properties. So, the two big necessities of life, food and shelter, are increasingly owned by people who are in the 1% and who are profit maximizers. So they do not care how hard your life is, but they will offer you an extremely expensive rental house and extremely expensive, crappy food, and they'll sell those things to you. And that's the whole you'll own nothing and be happy. You're not going to own a house anymore. You're going to rent. And you probably won't own a car anymore. You'll just take Uber wherever you go. So you're going to be, and you'll owe huge amounts of money for your worthless college degree. So you'll be incapable of making decisions for yourself, because you got to make that nut every month. You got to make your rent, and you got to make your car payment if you have a car, and you got to pay off your student loans. And so that's basically all you think about. So we're creating a bunch of docile wage or debt slaves who are basically serfs working on the plantations of extremely rich people, which takes us back to the 16, 1700s in Europe. And we're headed that way at an accelerating rate. So, so no matter how you look at it, you've got some weird thing going on that is not good for us, no matter how you slice it, and that is potentially really good for the already rich.
Yeah, well, it goes back to your Wall Street days and the power, just the powerful players, the companies that, like BlackRock that owns, our defense contracting businesses in America. Raytheon, I think Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, I think they're all owned by BlackRock, and the list goes on. But let's talk about the housing market, because obviously that's the industry that I serve. Unaffordable at best for wannabe home buyers, and becoming more unaffordable each day with rising housing costs like insurance, taxes, repairs, and maintenance for existing homeowners. You had mentioned, Wall Street buying up these single family houses. And getting back to your book, because back in 2003, you wrote a book, How to Profit from the Coming Real Estate Bust. And in your book, you predicted the 2008 housing crash. Maybe you didn't say, hey, it's going to be boom, right this month and this day. But along with this, you also predicted that during the crash, that real estate investors would profit from defaulting homeowners losing their homes due to foreclosures. You were also right about that, John. Now, almost 15 years after the historic market crash, are you surprised? When you were writing this book and it's sort of like it unfolded, and are you surprised of the effect that the investors have had on the housing market?
Not at all in retrospect, because what happened after the 2008-2009 bust is the federal government wanted to keep it from spreading to the big banks. They wanted to protect the banks, so they cut interest rates really dramatically, and they bailed out the banks in other ways so that everybody would have liquidity. And a bunch of Wall Street players looked around and thought, well, what can I do with all this liquidity? Oh, look at all those defaulted houses that the banks are stuck with now. We'll just buy them for pennies on the dollar, and then we'll clean them up a little bit and we'll flip them, or we'll rent them, or something like that. So they got a taste for what it's like to be a large scale landlord, and it was very profitable. So they decided they like real estate. So now they can still borrow incredibly cheaply. For a long time, their hedge funds and private equity companies could borrow for 0%. So they basically were working with free money with which to go around and buy up whole neighborhoods and then just convert the neighborhoods to rentals. And while interest rates were super low, that tends to make financial assets go up in value. So house prices went up, in part because Wall Street was buying them all, and in part because low interest rates make everybody else want to try to buy a house. So house prices went up, stock prices went up, and even bond prices went up for a long time. So these guys got incredibly rich. Real estate was part of it. And now they're still doing it. They're still borrowing money at relatively cheap interest rates. And then they're going out and buying massive amounts of real estate. And, you could say, depends on how you want to look at this. You can say, well, this is just Wall Street sharks being Wall Street sharks, and in the next crash, they'll lose all their money and houses will go back to the private sector or to the individual buyer. Or you could say that this is yet another case of the 1% buying up life's necessities and using those necessities to control people by turning them, for instance, from homeowners to renters. So, I was kind of agnostic on that. Are they evil or are they stupid kind of argument for a long time. But I'm starting to come around to the idea that so many of these things can't work exactly the same way. In other words, impoverish the 99% and enrich the 1% unless there's a plan behind them, right? Because, geopolitics, we start all these wars and it enriches the military industrial complex. Pandemic lockdowns, we do these really draconian lockdowns when there's a new illness that comes along. That enriches the pharmaceutical companies, who then turn around and finance mainstream media and political campaigns of the people who are enacting the lockdowns. Can all of these things work that way and be an accident? And I'm coming around to the idea that, there's you might call it a master plan at work behind the scenes, or you might call it just a confluence of interests on the part of the very rich, because they see that they can make more money by feasting off of the peasants. And so they do it over and over again. And it might look like a master plan, but it's just, a different group of rich idiots taking advantage of people over and over again. So I don't know, but it is a very repetitive process that we're seeing happen out there.
Yeah, it's getting worse. I mean, the repetitive process that seems to be getting larger in magnitude, where, you have more have-nots than the ones that have. And when we look, just in my career of 35 years serving the housing market, I've never seen anything like this last round of, really since the GFC. Investors over the last 10 years, 12 years, are competing. And it's like you said, if they're borrowing money at a way cheaper rate than a homeowner can, or they're taking advantage of non-performing loans and buying them from Fannie Mae, and buying them for, less than what the loan values are, and, 30% of what the value is on the actual asset, that should the people default, well, they want to kick them out so that they have this asset at a basement bargain price. And, but the interesting thing is these investors, they outbid. They ran the market up in home asset prices because they were competing with people that actually wanted to buy it and live in the house. They were paying cash, which, if you're a seller, what are you going to do? You're going to take the cash offer, or somebody that has to get an appraisal and, has to qualify for a loan, or just take the cash? Not only that, but they were buying them saying, you know what, we don't even care what the condition is. You have deferred maintenance, things that don't work, it doesn't matter, because we can fix it, for a lot cheaper than anybody else can. And we'll figure it out later. And then they were letting people stay in their home, which is like the icing on the cake. So if I said to you, hey, John, you don't know where you're going to go, no problem. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to settle on your house. We're going to do it in cash. So you're going to get paid in the next 2 weeks or 30 days. We're not going to ask for anything. We're not getting a home inspection. You don't have to worry about an appraisal. Not only that, but how long did you need to stay to figure it out, your next move? Oh, you need 6 months free rent, but no problem. As long as we get your asset, as long as we can transfer the deed to us, we'll give you the money. You could stay for 6 months and rent for free, rent back for free. How can a home buyer, number one, compete with that? The other thing is what you mentioned was, you're saying, do you think this is like just insanity and corporate America making very ridiculous decisions, or is this from companies that kind of know that regulations will prevent, an oversupply of housing? All they have to do is put moratoriums or just regulations that don't make housing affordable to build, and we are stuck with a very finite supply of inventory. It makes sense, right? So as long as we can keep the population intact, we're not having a massive population decline. And we've been doing this through immigration, because it's clear that we're having less babies than we ever have. So as long as we can keep the supply or the demand for the housing, and we have corporate America that will invest in it, hey, then we will rent and or own nothing and be happy. But the bigger play of this, if listening to you, is and that's why I love talking to you, because you bring this complete different perspective. I work in the trenches every single day. I'm in my mind, my own little world, I'm helping people. How do I afford this? how can I buy? Where's my little window of opportunity to get a deal that, doesn't, it seems, less and less of an opportunity every day. But what you're kind of saying here is that this may be a bigger plan to where, and not that, not that there's one evil ruler, but wealth, greed, when you talk about Bill Gates buying up all the farmland so he can control the food market, or you talk about, the pharmaceutical industry or whatever, it's same thing goes with housing. If we can gobble up all the housing, then we own the land and people don't have property rights. And one of the biggest powers that we have as Americans is to have property rights. So, and I want you to kind of elaborate on your thoughts on the housing market moving forward, because you did such a good job of predicting it before. And I know in prior conversations, you didn't really think that we were going to have this massive housing crash. And the more I dive into this, the more I think, well, it will be a certain point where Wall Street would just absorb all the inventory anyway, so they'll be back to competing with homeowners. But I read an article that stated that as of 2021, there are 14.3 million single-family rentals in the United States. And this is kind of important because, Wall Street used to invest in apartment buildings, right? They weren't diving into these single family rentals. But the housing crash of 2008 fed them these houses. Ultimately, that's what happened. So they got their taste of it. So what that 14.3 million single family rentals represents about 33% of all renters. So let's just say 1 in 3 renters are renting a home instead of owning it, right? And that would indicate that about 42.9 million households are renters in America. And according to the United States Census Bureau, we have about 127 million households in the U.S. So with these numbers, about 33.8% are renters and about 66.2% are actual homeowners. Now, of that, we have to wonder how many of them can afford to be living in their house now, with the affordability getting worse. So that'd do one of two things. If the unaffordability continues and these homeowners can't afford to be in their home, they're not going to be fixing them up. So what does that mean? That means eventually they're going to have to sell them, and they're going to be selling them to people that can't get loans because the houses are being too poor of shape. So that will open that up. So it's almost like, are we setting up the homeowners that a large portion of these homeowners that can't afford to make repairs and that have been in forbearance and remodifications and things like that, eventually the roof is going to cave in, right? If they don't fix it. So what do you kind of think, like with all of these things, because in our past conversations, as you're now seeing more of this unfold, and your Substack will drop below. You do an amazing job of staying current with your writing. But what do you think is going to happen now to the housing market? Do you think that we are, what does a crash nowadays look like?
Well, one of the things that should be happening now is a housing crash. And the fact that it hasn't yet makes me wonder what's different about it this time. But here's the scenario for the housing crash that should be happening right now. All those baby boomers out there in McMansions, if you're 70 years old and your knees aren't so good anymore and you might need a hip replacement, and you've got a 3-story house on an acre of land that needs to be maintained, you're in the wrong place, right? And so logically, boomers should be downsizing in a tidal wave right now. They should be selling their bigger houses and either going into condos where they never even have to change a light bulb, or going to smaller houses where there's a lot less upkeep and it's on one floor. They're not doing that. And that's kind of why the housing market is frozen right now, because, you could have this massive wave of inventory hitting the market if boomers were behaving the way that 70-year-olds normally behave. So we've got this kind of a demographic question mark out there, and it's not going the way it should, but I still think it probably will at some point, because if it's not 70, then 75-year-old is too old to have that big house and everything. So it has to happen eventually. Now, while boomers are dumping their houses in this scenario, you've got Airbnb people who've built empires by buying 15, 20, 25 rental houses with super cheap money. And now it's turning out that Airbnbs aren't the great deal that they once were. And a lot of those houses aren't profitable anymore. So they're going to have to put their inventory back on the market. Let those two things happen, boomers and Airbnb people, flood the system with new houses. And then the Wall Streeters who own a bunch of houses are going to see the value of their assets go down. And Wall Street, hedge funds and private equity guys tend to panic when things don't go their way. So they'll start selling their houses. So you get this basically cascade failure of the housing market where all the big players suddenly have to get out and prices have to plunge back down to affordable levels and beyond. And none of that's happening. That should all be happening right now, but it's not, especially with mortgage rates at like 7%. There aren't a lot of people who can buy with money that expensive. So you would think you would have a buyer's strike and a seller's panic in this kind of a market, but none of it is happening. And I don't really have a good explanation for why not. Sometimes things happen the way they should, but just not on the schedule that seems reasonable. So this could be one of those things where, all right, it should be happening already, but it's going to happen 5 years from now in any event. But I can't explain it. You would think that houses being as unaffordable as they are would have to fall in price, right? I mean, high prices are the cure for high prices, as the old saying goes. But none of that's happening. So I think we just have to wait and see.
But do you think it'd be a consolidation? I mean, I think of banks. We talked about Russia. I think about them having Russia as one of the. They're the largest country in the world, and I think about them having 450 banks, and we have 4,500 banks. I think a consolidation. I think about all of the REITs or the funds that have houses. There may be a consolidation. I mean, rather than like a bank will get taken over by a bigger bank. JP Morgan comes in and takes over the bank because of the, wiping out the investors. So if you look at it and you go, okay, if I bought a house for $400,000 as an investment fund, how much of that did I actually put up of my money? Well, I could be absorbed. And the tenant stays in the house. They don't get thrown out. A tenant's lease is forever, and even death doesn't terminate a lease of a landlord, passing on. The tenant still has their ownership rights under that lease. So do you think it'd just be a situation where, this larger REIT or home business, rental business, single family housing rental fund absorbs, the government comes in and says, look, we can't put all these, you own 150,000 houses. You can't go out of business and liquidate the market and flood the market with these houses. What we're going to do is wipe out your investors and then basically let another fund absorb your assets. I mean, couldn't that happen?
Well, that's probably what a lot of these guys expect to happen. That, oh yeah, then in the next cycle, we'll just get even bigger and we'll buy everybody out. And maybe, but there's an awful lot of financial entities out there that are at risk from real estate prices going down,
and the government,
the local, regional. Yeah, well, the government's the
property taxes. I mean, let's imagine, okay, let's just say we have a massive. I mean, think about it. The states depend on property taxes. So take us back to the Obama administration, and we had the GFC. He was, right in his lap. Boom, here you go. Have the great global, whatever, financial crisis. Everyone's losing, massive foreclosures. Now all of a sudden, the banks take these properties back. They go, well, we've got to pay the property taxes and the insurance on these assets. Well, we're financially insolvent. The government says, well, we can't have you financially insolvent because if you can't continue to afford to protect the assets, we're going to get these houses back in tax sale. And what are we going to do with them? We don't want the houses. We want the property tax because the states will go bankrupt without property taxes. It's a big number, right? And so when you back that out and you go, okay, well, we have these large hedge funds that own all these houses. Aren't they too big to fail?
There's a lot of things out there that are defined as too big to fail right now. That's a crazy concept. I mean, if you're too big to fail, you're too big to exist, break that thing up into 5 smaller pieces so that the market forces can act on them. But yeah, it is liable to start with commercial real estate. Okay. Here's one scenario for this all playing out, that a bunch of office buildings are sold at huge losses, which is happening out there right now. The
Everywhere.
bank, yeah, everywhere. And so the local and regional banks that own a lot of that paper have to take big losses. They have to recognize the losses on those sales. Um, that spooks their depositors who pull their deposits out, which forces the local and regional banks to sell more assets at losses in order to pay off their depositors, which basically bankrupts them. And when one goes bankrupt, all the rest go bankrupt because that spooks everybody and everybody pulls out of them. So the government is forced to step in with loan guarantees and direct infusions of cash and pretty much anything you can imagine that counts as a bailout. They have to come back and do that on the scale of several $trillion. But while that's happening, these Wall Street guys who own a lot of real estate too, they start to go bankrupt because they're in the same boat. They own assets that are losing value and they've leveraged those assets. So they got to pay off their loans too, and it doesn't work for them. And so the federal government is in a place where, where it was in 2009, but on steroids, it's even bigger. And so they're stepping up to bail people out, but the bailouts actually make things worse in a lot of cases because then everybody can see who's insolvent, and that spooks everybody else who's looking around for who's next. And you get a cascade failure of the financial system. So we're in grave danger of something like that happening, where it all falls back on the government. And then that's to say it falls back on the currency. So all of a sudden, does anybody want to own the currency of a government that has banks going bust, and then hedge funds going bust, and individuals losing their houses, and like you said, property tax revenues plunging, and state and local pensions going bust because they depend on property taxes, or they depend on the assets that are falling in price. This is the kind of thing that spreads so quickly and involves so many big players that a government can only bail everybody out with some kind of blanket thing, right? Where they just, in the 1930s, they closed all the banks and they had a bank holiday for a while they sorted everything out. Well, there's an analyst named Jim Rickards who has a very coherent explanation for how all this is going to play out. And one of the pieces of his scenario is a bank holiday of some sort, where they just shut down the financial system. And yeah, you've got a brokerage account with $500,000 in it, but you can't get to it now because the brokerage house is shut down. You've got you payroll in a bank, but the bank is shut down, so you can't make payroll. Things like that are going to happen during the bank holiday. See, there's no way to avoid the crisis. All we have left is a choice of how the crisis plays out based on how we respond to the crisis. So that's our not too distant future. And, it's up to us as individuals to get through this, because the governments of the world and the big financial institutions are going to be of zero help when the time comes.
Yeah, well, this all gets back to, where we started in the beginning is, you'll own nothing and maybe you'll be happy, maybe you won't. But I mean, when you think about it, what you're just describing, people don't own stocks. They buy into another company's ownership of having the stocks. I mean, you don't, unless you have the stock paper, the certificate, you don't really own the stock. And this is kind of where things are headed. I mean, we don't own our houses. We're renting. 33% of single family homes are rentals. So, I mean, they're at the mercy of their landlord, whoever that is, right? So, I mean, it's just, we don't rent, we don't own our music, we don't own our books, we don't own we have subscriptions to everything, and at any minute we can just be basically shut out. And the bad thing is we can't do anything anymore. You go back 100 years ago, 60% of the house, maybe 70% of the houses, I don't even think it was 100 years ago. You go back 70 or 80 years, 60% of the houses, had electricity. Even just that short distance ago in time, people lived in houses where they didn't have electricity or running water. But yet we lived because we could, grow food, we could do things. And now we don't know how to do anything. So you can't offer us anything, John, any kind of, tangible predictions of this housing market other than you're stumped. I think we all are.
Well, I mean, it's heading in a bad direction. The housing market is, and the question is why haven't we already hit that wall? Because home price affordability is as bad as it's ever been. In other words, the average person can't buy the average house.
Yeah, post World War II.
Yeah. So that's normally the limiting factor, right? When affordability gets so bad that buyers just can't buy, then obviously sellers have to cut their prices in order to sell. And that's when you get things going back down. That's not happening yet.
One of my agents today, before we jumped on here, said that he had a deal fall apart. And we're seeing this a lot. What happened was you want to buy a home. So you get pre-qualified. So you kind of understand about what your payment's going to be. Well, then you realize that when you get into, let's just say, a highly competitive home and it goes for, and you're bidding along because you want it. You're not consulting with your loan officer as far as what that difference in payment will be, but you just get involved in it and you're excited and you want to outbid and get the house. And that's what happened. They paid $20,000 more than what their budget was for the house. And over the weekend, they received their new numbers, their mortgage numbers, and they can't afford it. So now they're in a situation where they have to back out. And we are seeing this more and more every day. And I'm going in homes where people can't afford to fix things. And you're looking at it and you go, and most people argue with me on this, but a house is a depreciating asset. It will fall down around you. If you're not keeping it up, it will be worth less money. It just doesn't automatically appreciate. The land appreciates. The house deteriorates. So we're starting to see now the effects of the economy where most people aren't seeing this. You drive down the road, you're ignorant, right? You're going to the store, you're going to work. Unless you live next to a struggling homeowner, you're not seeing that the grass isn't being maintained, that the siding blew off the back and they're not fixing it or anything like that, right? So what's happening is we're seeing this as real estate professionals going into people's lives and seeing, do I have to fix this? I don't really have the money to do it, blah, blah, blah. I tell you, I wish that I had a positive outlook on this. I think we're in for a massive correction. The question is, like you said, will Wall Street have the appetite, or who will have the appetite to come in? And I think that's going to be the deciding factor of how these asset prices adjust. Because I believe that we may be in a situation where we see prices come down to a level that the investors will buy it and still outbid the homeowners, and we'll turn even more and more every day into a renter's nation, which I think is horrible. So, but let's kind of go and turn our focus and kind of end it on CBDC, because I know you have an understanding of this way more than I do. This to me is like a scary space when we look at the power and the control of the rich or the elites and the manipulation that they can play out to basically get what they want, right? Our housing, our food, our healthcare, our things like that really make us powerless, right? As a society, it's happening. We tried to escape that, right? For a couple hundred years, it's worked. Tell us about CBDC. What kind of an implication will it have? And it seems like it's unstoppable.
Well, conceptually, we can put it this way. They're increasingly owning all the food. They're increasingly owning all the houses. Now they're going to own all the money. Even what is in your bank account is going to be owned by the government. They're going to set up these new accounts with a new, what's called a digital currency, central bank digital currency. And you'll have an account instead of with your local bank, you'll have it with the Federal Reserve. And they're going to tell you that, oh, it's so much more convenient and transactions are so much quicker and cheaper and everything. But what it really is a means of control. They're going to see everything you do. They're going to know how much money you have in your account. And the money is going to be basically something that's programmable. They can change the value of it if they want. They can give it an expiration date so that you have to spend it before it ceases to exist. And they're going to know everything you do with that money. If you, for instance, if you donate to the campaign of an anti-war political candidate who's running against a government prosecuted war, the government knows you did that, and they can take steps if they don't like it. Like they can, we're seeing it now where people get debanked if they oppose government policies. Well, this is going to be that, but much easier for the government, where they just see you buy something they don't approve of, and they affect your account in some way, and there's nothing you can do about it. Because, are you going to call the police? They are the police. There's nothing you can do when they decide to do something to your bank account, or to use the information that they're gleaning from what you're spending and how you're spending it to force you to behave in a certain way. That's the end result of CBDCs is going to be increased government control. So in each case, housing, food, money, there are things we can do as individuals to at least stave off the inevitable and maybe stop it from happening forever. And that's kind of where, after you go through all the gloom and doomy stuff and all the bad things that could happen and all the evil things that are being done by rich people, you come to the things that you have the power to control. And it's not a long list, but it's a legit list. There are things we can do to protect ourselves from all of this stuff. And I think that's the intellectual challenge. It's figuring out how to structure your own life so you're resilient when these bad things that are coming actually finally happen. And my Substack newsletter is based on that, and actionable stuff that you can do. And it turns out there's quite a bit, and once you get going, it's actually kind of fun to start setting things up so that this won't hurt you when it happens and that won't hurt you when it happens. And that's basically my beat now as a reporter, trying to figure out ways to get around the crazy stuff that's coming.
Well, listening to you talk about, if the government now wants to know what you're spending your money on, they would have to go to the banks and request your credit card statements. Maybe they would do that they do that through the IRS, right? If you're audited or whatever, they go and they look at your bank records, they look at your credit card statements. But what you're saying is they have this central bank digital currency that the government actually owns. Then your money is with them. And all they have to do is, click on your ID or whatever, and they can see exactly where and what you've spent your money on. So it's sort of like a privacy thing, we're giving away. We kind of come up with these ideas to say, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to protect you. Your money's going to be more secure. But in fact, it really isn't. Just like having cameras on every street corner, is supposed to protect us. But in fact, you don't have any privacy anymore. They have access to everything. So, I don't know, man. This is, it's kind of a strange world. I think this is a process that's happened over time. What do you think about, I said we were going to end it with CBDC, but I have to ask you, what is your opinion on the United Nations Agenda 2030? Are you familiar with that? And as that pertains to getting back to real estate?
Well, the Agenda 2030 is a bunch of really nice buzzwords. It's a page of, we're going to eliminate poverty, and we're going to, spread water around the world. Everybody's going to have good drinking water, things like that, things that are unassailable goals. But knowing what we know about the people in charge right now, you can bet that the implementation of most of these things is going to come at a cost in terms of privacy and freedom. So yeah, I don't approve of the 2030 agenda. And not because I don't like all the buzzwords they have on the page. I just think that we can't trust them to take us in those directions without there being an element of control attached to it all.
Well,
And
they make you sound like it makes it seem like you're you're an idiot if you don't you want the world to, last forever? I mean, don't you want the earth to be sustainable? I mean, why would you want to, kill the earth for your great grandkids? I mean, I get it. I mean, I understand these buzzwords that you're saying, but it's
well,
they package it in a way that if you go against it, you're a really bad person.
Yeah, every evil plan is couched in terms of really good goals. In other words, it's one of those "the path to hell is paved with good intentions" thing for a lot of the people who go along with it. For the guys in charge, I don't think they have good intentions either. I think they're just using focus grouped buzzwords in order to get what they want. And we could go on for hours, but we haven't even talked about how specifically we've already lost a lot of freedom. The CBDCs are going to be kind of the last stone in the edifice of the wall. Where we've already lost a lot of freedom and privacy because. Do you know how cars work now from the point of view of privacy? Oh, they're worse than cell phones. Your cars, a new car obviously records your driving habits. It also records your voice, and it can access your phone and download all your images and your emails and your texts and send them to the car company, who is legally allowed to do anything they want to with them. And that's something that most people don't know. I didn't know that until I started looking around for privacy.
I didn't know that either.
Jeez. Yes. And that's how new cars work. And it's very hard.
Can you opt out of that?
You can opt out of it, but in doing so, you opt out of a whole bunch of nice features. So you have to give
And you're also on a list of people that opted out, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Right. There's a reason why you don't want us to listen to everything and have all of your data. So we're going to put you guys in a special list.
Yes, exactly. So you opt out of your car's surveillance, then the NSA just uses that as an excuse to surveil your phone more closely. So but I mean, that's the world we live in right now. And in every case, there are some things you can do about it. It's tough with cars because you lose safety features if you disconnect the surveillance and stuff like that. But, that should be a really important part of our planning for the next decade in our own lives, is figuring out exactly what's happening.
Buy a 1980s car.
Hey, that's
is that why they're very expensive right now?
It could well be. There's some smart people out there. The same guys who are stacking gold and silver really aggressively and have guns and everything. They're buying older cars, and partially for that reason, maybe. So, yeah. So,
John, give us some things that we can do to prepare. I mean, obviously, we talk about some things that don't sound very good. I mean, it's it's crazy because you want to be positive, you want to think good things, but when you don't feel like you have control, I mean, I think one of the nice things about, before, not now, but years before, decades before, was that you felt like you had a voice, you felt like you had a choice. And it seems like that's becoming, non-existent. So what can people do to sort of prepare themselves for some of these geopolitical issues that could come to pass, or home ownership issues, with just finances in general?
Well, there's a huge number of things that you can do. One, on the financial side, it's not going to be an immediate move to central bank digital currencies and then everything else is illegal. So, plan on having some cash around and start accumulating real forms of money like gold and silver, because, in the end, if you want to transact privately, there's never been a time in human history when you couldn't do that with gold coins or silver coins. So assume you're going to be able to do that going forward and just have some real money. So, when you're concerned about what might happen with that CBD account that they forced you to take on and stuff like that, then you can go to your gold and silver and you can spend that. Look for ways to become extremely resilient in a financial crisis. So gold and silver is very helpful for that too, but so is land that you can grow food on. If you've got a homestead, you're halfway there. Slap some solar panels up, plant some crops, find out how to do that correctly. And if you can grow half your food, then the fact that there are food shortages out there because Bill Gates decided he wants to jack up the price of wheat and corn, that won't be life-threatening for you. Basic skills. Our grandparents knew how to do things. They could make things and they could fix things. And we drifted away from that. The average college-educated American has to hire a handyman to hang a door or something like that. And God forbid that they've got to look under their car's hood and figure out, what's up with the air filter or something like that too. So we should become handymen or handy people to the extent that that's possible. And we should encourage our kids to learn skills like that, even though, they would rather play video games. Well, they should learn how to wire a lamp or something like that. They should learn how to farm along with you. And to the extent that we get better and better at self-sufficiency, and that includes self-defense too. There's a saying going around now that if you can't defend your rights, you don't have rights. And I agree. So it might be time, if you've been putting it off, to look into the whole firearms thing. Figure out how they work, figure out what you need. I've got a series on Substack, started with Your First Gun, and it explains how a 9mm semi-automatic pistol works and what circumstances you want one and things like that. And that story goes on through AR-15s and shotguns and whatever else might be appropriate for your situation as it unfolds. So these are all things we could be doing right now. There's no need to put any of that stuff off because it's all available to individuals. And, it's very helpful to achieve a lot of those things. And it's psychologically helpful to be doing it because, it's easy to feel helpless listening to the first 3/4 of the show, right? Because we spelled out some really dark trends that are in place right now. But if at the same time you're hearing this stuff, you're taking concrete steps to make your own life better and make yourself more resilient, then all those gloom and doomy predictions is a little extra incentive to get with the program that you're already on. And that's psychologically so much more healthy. You're an optimist, even though bad things are coming when you're taking these kinds of steps.
Well, John, as always, I appreciate your time and having you back on the show, and I'm sure this is very helpful for a lot of people. I'm encouraging people to go to your Substack. It is pinned below. You guys can see it very easily in the comments section, and cruise on over to John, and he has a lot to say. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Todd. Look forward to it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the video with John Rubino, and thanks for making it to the end. If you liked the video, you can let John and I know you did by hitting that thumbs up button. Also, if you haven't subscribed to Sachs Realty, please consider doing so now. Hit the alert bell and you'll be notified every time we publish content just like this. And if you think this video is worth sharing, please hit the share button below. Share it with your family and friends. It would be the biggest compliment that you could provide.
Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.